The first thing I saw that morning was a man in khaki shorts planting a "Reserved for HOA" sign right in the middle of my pasture. Not on the edge. Not near the road. Smack dab in the center of my property, like it had always belonged there. My second sight was Karen Whitmore, clad in her signature pastel cardigan, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, standing on a makeshift stage with a microphone, declaring in a booming voice, "Welcome to the first annual HOA Dog Show." I nearly choked on my coffee. A dog show? In my pasture? I blinked, half expecting this to be a heat-stroke-induced hallucination. But no, there they were. Folding chairs. White tents. Tables covered in bright banners that read "Best in Show" and "Obedience Champion." And dogs. Dozens of them. Fluffy Pomeranians, prissy poodles, and golden retrievers with coats shinier than my truck's hood. I stepped onto my porch, arms crossed, watching as Karen waved like she was hosting a parade. Meanwhile, her army of HOA members scurried around, setting up obstacle courses and rolling out velvet carpets for their purebred champions. And then, as if things weren't ridiculous enough, I spotted a literal trophy stand gleaming under the morning sun. These people had planned a full-blown competition on land they didn't own. I took a deep breath, marched down my porch steps, and strode straight through their little fantasy land. A few HOA members gasped when they saw me approaching, as if a wild animal had wandered into their royal dog kingdom. Karen, however, remained unbothered, a smug smile tugging at her lips. "Luke, so glad you're here," she trilled, her voice oozing with fake warmth. I narrowed my eyes. "What the hell is all this?" Karen gave an exaggerated laugh and gestured around. "Oh, just a little community event to celebrate our wonderful neighborhood dogs. Isn't it marvelous?" I glanced at the speaker system they'd set up, the catering truck parked by my fence, the rows of decorative banners, and the growing crowd of HOA members in sun hats and polos. "You're standing on my property." Karen tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Well, technically, the pasture is part of the community's aesthetic enjoyment, so it's practically shared space." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "The hell it is. This is private land." She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Luke, you always get so technical with these things. We're all neighbors, aren't we? Shouldn't we be embracing the spirit of togetherness?" A blonde woman in a tennis visor nodded enthusiastically beside her. "Yes, Luke. Think of the joy this brings to everyone." I was thinking of the damage their event was about to bring to my pasture. I was thinking of how they had the audacity to set up their self-important dog circus without so much as a knock on my door. But most of all, I was thinking of how absolutely and utterly done I was with Karen's nonsense. I stepped closer, voice steady. "You've got exactly 15 minutes to pack up and get off my land." Karen's smile widened like a politician caught in a lie. "Oh, Luke, don't be so grumpy. The event has already started. It would be simply impossible to cancel now." I inhaled sharply, glancing around at the yapping dogs and their owners adjusting bow ties on their perfectly groomed pets. I could see it now, tiny paws digging up my grass, expensive shoes trampling the fresh soil, a few overzealous Labradors treating my fence posts like fire hydrants. This wasn't going to be a temporary inconvenience. This was an invasion. I turned back to Karen, who was now flipping through a stack of suspicious-looking papers. "I have the community bylaws right here," she said smugly, "and they clearly state that." I wasn't listening. My attention had shifted to something far more interesting, my flock of herding sheep, lazily grazing on the far side of the field. That's when it hit me. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to shout. I didn't even need to call the cops. I had something far better. Karen wanted a show? Fine. She was about to get one. I took a step back, my anger melting into something far more satisfying. "All right," I said, my tone suddenly agreeable. "Go ahead. Have your little dog show." Karen blinked. "Really?" I nodded. "Of course. Enjoy yourselves." A few HOA members clapped, relieved that I had finally seen the spirit of community. Karen beamed, looking far too pleased with herself. I turned on my heel and strolled back toward my house, but not before throwing a glance at my sheep. They were calm, unsuspecting. But they were also well-trained. Very well-trained. And if there was one thing they loved more than fresh grass, it was an opportunity to herd anything that moved. Karen and her pristine dog Show had no idea what was coming. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the pasture, illuminating the rows of meticulously groomed dogs sitting obediently by their owners. The judges, an overenthusiastic trio of HOA committee members, were making their rounds, inspecting each canine with exaggerated importance. Karen stood at the center, microphone in hand, looking like she was about to personally crown a royal champion. The event had unfolded exactly as she had planned, with not a single thought spared for the fact that it was all happening on land that wasn't hers. Luke leaned casually against his fence, watching with the kind of patient amusement one has before lighting a firework. His gaze flicked over to his sheep, who were still grazing peacefully, completely unaware that their day was about to get a whole lot more exciting. He gave a low whistle. It was a specific pitch, a command they had been trained to recognize. The reaction wasn't immediate. At first, the sheep merely lifted their heads, ears twitching in his direction. Then, one by one, they started moving, their usual slow amble replaced by a determined trot. The herd shifted like a single, coordinated unit, flowing toward the open pasture with silent precision. The first person to notice was an elderly woman with a yappy little terrier. She let out a small gasp as the mass of woolly bodies approached. "Oh my, are those sheep?" she asked, her voice teetering between fascination and concern. A few people turned, murmuring in curiosity. Karen, still locked in her self-absorbed announcements, didn't notice until the first wave of sheep reached the competition area. It was a slow, almost gentle invasion at first. They mingled with the dogs, sniffing curiously at the prissy poodles and snooty spaniels. Then the real chaos began. One of the sheep nudged a Dalmatian, who let out a startled bark and bolted. That single burst of motion triggered something deep in the sheep's instincts. The moment they saw the movement, their training kicked in. They were herding animals, after all. And now, to them, everything in the pasture was fair game. The entire flock surged forward. The once dignified show dogs became instant target. A golden retriever, freshly bathed and brushed to perfection, yelped as a particularly enthusiastic sheep herded it in tight circles. A Pomeranian vanished beneath a wave of wool, only to reappear moments later, looking utterly traumatized. Karen shrieked into the microphone. "What is happening? Stop this madness." Luke had to bite back a grin. He wasn't about to stop anything. The judges attempted to maintain some order, flailing their clipboards and shouting commands that fell on deaf ears. The sheep didn't care. They were locked in. Every time a dog tried to escape, the herd adjusted, blocking its path, funneling it back into the chaos. Even the biggest dogs, the ones Karen had been boasting about earlier, were no match for the relentless strategy of a well-trained flock. A Great Dane attempted to jump over the fence, only to be intercepted midair by two determined sheep, sending it tumbling back into the fray. A prize-winning poodle, its curls perfectly coiffed, found itself cornered by three sheep, all staring it down like it was a misbehaving lamb. It whimpered in surrender. Owners scrambled to retrieve their dogs, some diving into the madness, others frozen in sheer disbelief. The once organized dog show had devolved into an entirely new type of competition, one where the sheep had all the power. Karen was hysterical. She was waving her clipboard wildly, barking orders at the sheep as if they understood human bureaucracy. "Get back! Shoo! You're ruining everything!" The sheep did not shoo. Instead, one particularly bold ewe took a keen interest in Karen herself. With perfect precision, it lowered its head and charged forward, nudging Karen's knees just enough to send her sprawling onto the dirt. The microphone squealed with feedback as it hit the ground beside her, amplifying her horrified wails. Luke finally allowed himself a chuckle. Among the chaos, one dog stood out. A scrappy mutt named Tank, short-legged and a little rough around the edges, wasn't running in fear like the others. Instead, he was watching the sheep, eyes sharp, muscles tensed. Then, as if something inside him had awakened, he sprang into action. Tank weaved through the chaos, barking sharply. But unlike the other panicked yelps, his voice had purpose. The sheep hesitated for a moment, then responded. Tank darted in and out, positioning himself with precision, guiding the flock rather than running from it. Luke straightened, surprised. That dog had instinct. Pure, raw, untapped herding talent. Karen, now covered in dust and tangled in what remained of her dignity, pointed a trembling finger at Tank. Somebody stop that mutt. But nobody did. In fact, the HOA members, many of whom had turned against Karen the moment their beloved purebreds had been humiliated, were now watching Tank with awe. "That's incredible," someone whispered. "He's a natural," another agreed. Even the police officer who had arrived to assess the commotion paused, watching with an appreciative nod. "That's a working dog if I've ever seen one," he muttered. Tank continued his work, and within minutes the chaos began to settle. The sheep, once the terrors of the event, were now neatly arranged in a circle, corralled with expert precision by the unlikely underdog. The silence that followed was almost comical. The perfectly styled dogs were exhausted, their owners disheveled. The judges, their clipboards long abandoned, simply stood in shock. Karen, still fuming, struggled to her feet. "This is an outrage. We'll have you fined, Luke. This is a clear violation of community order." The police officer raised an eyebrow. "Violation? Ma'am, from what I see, you trespassed onto private property, held an unauthorized event, and then lost control of it. If anything, I should be fining you." Karen's face drained of color. But the bylaws." Luke smirked, folding his arms. "Barking up the wrong tree, Karen." One of the judges, still looking slightly dazed, cleared his throat. "Well, technically, if this is still a competition." He looked at Tank, then at the sheep, and back at the tired show dogs. "I think we have a winner." The crowd murmured in agreement. Luke grinned, kneeling down to ruffle Tank's fur. "Looks like you just won your first championship, buddy." Karen let out an inhuman shriek, but it was drowned out by the sound of applause. The HOA members, no longer under her spell, erupted into cheers. Some even whistled. The officer chuckled. "You know, I don't normally make it to these community events, but I gotta say, this one was worth it." Luke stood, tipping his hat. "Glad you enjoyed the show." As the crowd dispersed, dragging their exhausted dogs with them, Karen stomped off toward her car, vowing revenge. But Luke wasn't worried. He had already won. And so had Tank. Karen stood there, panting, her pastel cardigan covered in dust, her meticulously curled hair in wild disarray. The once pristine dog show had turned into a scene of absolute destruction. Tables were overturned, velvet banners trampled into the dirt, and the prize-winning poodle still hadn't recovered from its encounter with the herd. The trophy stand was lopsided, the grand event reduced to nothing more than a chaotic pasture filled with exhausted dogs, bewildered owners, and a triumphant herd of sheep. But the centerpiece of it all, the moment that sealed everything, was Tank, standing tall, tongue lolling out, as the true champion of the day. Luke adjusted his hat, taking in the spectacle with pure satisfaction. Karen had spent months planning this ridiculous event, likely rubbing her hands together in delight at the thought of hosting a grand HOA function that would solidify her control over the neighborhood. She had envisioned herself as the queen of the community, standing at the podium, awarding golden ribbons to her fellow HOA elites, ensuring the lesser homeowners knew their place. Instead, she had been herded into the dirt, quite literally, by a flock of sheep and a scrappy mutt with more skill than every overbred show dog combined. The police officer, who had been quietly observing the entire situation, let out a low chuckle. "Well, that's one hell of a turn of events." Karen spun toward him, breathless with fury. "Did you see that?" That wild animal ruined everything. I want him removed immediately. This entire mess is an attack on the integrity of the HOA. The officer raised an unimpressed eyebrow. An attack? Ma'am, the only thing I saw was a dog doing exactly what he was born to do. If anything, you should be thanking him. Looks like he prevented a full-blown stampede. Karen's mouth opened and closed, her mind scrambling for an argument that would make sense, but there was nothing she could say to change the reality of what had happened. Her grand event had been hijacked, not by Luke, not even by the sheep, but by Tank, a mutt that she had ignored the entire competition, dismissing him as unworthy of even being on the field. One of the judges, still looking rattled, hesitantly stepped forward and cleared his throat. I think we need to formally acknowledge the winner. His voice wavered as he gestured toward Tank, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. I mean, given the circumstances, there's no denying that he was the only competitor who showed real skill today. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The same HOA members who had gasped in horror just moments before were now nodding in agreement, their perspectives shifting as they processed what they had just witnessed. Some even clapped. A few dog owners, now covered in dust and realizing that their meticulously bred champions had been completely outperformed, begrudgingly admitted that Tank had, indeed, earned the title. Luke grinned, kneeling beside the mutt and ruffling his fur. Hear that, boy? You just won the whole damn thing. Karen's face was a shade of red that had yet to be categorized. She turned back to the officer, desperate for some semblance of control. You don't understand. That pasture is community property. We had every right to host this event here, and this man, she jabbed a trembling finger at Luke, has been disruptive and antagonistic since the very beginning. The officer sighed, clearly at the end of his patience. Ma'am, I've looked over the property records. This land belongs to Luke Parker. Not the HOA. Not the community. Just him. Karen's breath hitched. That can't be right. Luke folded his arms. It's right. But I guess facts have never been your strong suit. The officer glanced at the assembled HOA members, most of whom were now exchanging nervous glances, realizing that they had been blindly following Karen's lead without actually checking the legalities themselves. And, the officer continued, since it seems like this whole event was set up without the property owner's permission, that means all of this technically falls under trespassing. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Karen's expression twisted into something that resembled both fury and panic. This is outrageous. I refuse to be treated like some sort of criminal. I was doing something for the community. The officer gave her a long, unimpressed stare. Lady, you broke into a man's field and threw a dog show without permission. I'm being real generous by not hauling you down to the station right now. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some of the HOA members who had been die-hard Karen supporters were now inching away, suddenly less enthusiastic about being associated with her. It was one thing to support an overzealous event planner. It was another to be wrapped up in an actual trespassing charge. Luke took a slow, satisfied breath. This was better than he had imagined. He had figured the sheep would create chaos, but watching Karen's entire empire crumble under the weight of her own arrogance was something else entirely. The judge, sensing that the show needed some kind of conclusion, hesitantly held up the last remaining intact ribbon, the one that had been meant for Best in Show. With an awkward cough, he extended it toward Tank. Well, I suppose this belongs to him now. Luke took it with a chuckle and tied it loosely around Tank's neck. The mutt wiggled happily, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just become the most controversial champion in HOA history. Karen looked around, her mouth opening and closing, but there was no recovering from this. No clever spin, no last-minute scheme. She had lost. Utterly, completely, and in the most public way possible. The officer clapped Luke on the back. Seems like you've got yourself a real champion here. Luke smirked. Sure does. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, dragging their exhausted, humiliated dogs with them, Karen stood frozen in place, shaking with anger. Finally, she let out a frustrated growl and stormed off toward her car, muttering about how this wasn't over. Luke just watched her go, knowing full well that it was, in fact, over. At least for now. The pasture was in ruins, but it had been worth it. He scratched Tank behind the ears as the last of the HOA members trickled out, leaving behind a few trampled banners and a lingering sense of poetic justice. The sheep, now thoroughly entertained, wandered back to their usual grazing spots, as if none of it had ever happened. Luke stretched, letting out a satisfied sigh. Well, Tank, looks like we just put an end to Karen's reign of terror. Tank let out a happy bark, as if agreeing. Luke headed back to his porch, tipping his hat as the sun dipped lower in the sky. He had no doubt Karen would stew over this for weeks, probably longer. She'd try to find another way to assert her ridiculous authority. But for now, peace had been restored, and the land was his once again. As he leaned against the railing, watching the last of the day fade away, he smirked to himself. Next time Karen wanted to use his land for one of her ridiculous schemes, she'd think twice. And if she didn't? Well, he still had plenty of sheep.